So Recess is a thing, but you already knew that. This was a pretty big show in the West, so if you haven't at least heard of Recess, you were either not born or living somewhere on the outsides of the margins of the age demographic. It was arguably one of Disney's most successful children's shows ever. It seemed that any kid or even adult that saw this show got something out of it, and its popularity and excellence have cemented it as a classic. Despite its generic and formulaic episodes, the show was a masterclass in subverting character tropes in order to surprise fans with fully realized characters. And I'm not just referring to the iconic main cast, but the side characters and antagonists too. I don't remember when I first watched Recess, but I remember it being on after school basically every day on the Family Channel. I live in rural Canada, so the Disney Channel was not readily available. But every day I would get home from school and get a chance to hang out with some of my favorite schoolyard chums. I found the stories interesting and it offered just the right amount of hijinks. Even as I grew up and my attention moved over to other Disney Channel shows like The Weekenders or Fillmore, I still enjoyed Recess for its wacky roster of playground kids and the kind of secret world of play they engaged in out there in the schoolyard. After many years, I still remember Recess fondly, but I'll admit it's been a good long while since I watched an episode. So on a whim, I went back to see what it was like, and like a lot of cartoons from my childhood, I was surprised to find how well it stood up. The animation on the older seasons isn't the greatest, but it definitely cleaned up for the later specials and finale. And the fact that this show even got a finale is pretty unheard of, actually. But the thing that stood out to me the most upon rewatching as an adult was that the show is chock full of references. Almost every episode is a direct homage or reference to a classic piece of media. As a kid, I hadn't seen enough, or was probably too stupid to figure it out, but I honestly think that this show was my first introduction to some really famous movies and tropes, which is cool in itself, but it was one reference in particular that caught my attention because it's more overarching than any of the others, and it's the obvious reference to Cold War era and prison break media. This is more than just a passing reference. It hits to the deeper meaning of the show. It is what makes the show capable of repackaging some profound ideas for children without dumbing them down. Ideas like the aesthetics and tone of the show, representations of individualistic ideologies, and social order and structure, which all play into our conceptions, biases, and philosophies of learning and education. And so today, I want to talk about Recess. Recess actually owes its creation to Rugrats of all things. TV writer and producer Paul Germain worked with Klasky Csupo and was one of the driving forces behind getting Rugrats created for Nickelodeon. When the first season of production was set to start, Germain called on Joe Ancelabahir to help him run and write the show. The pair worked together for the first 2 seasons of the show and realized that they had great working chemistry, and after 2 years of working tirelessly on what was a massive hit for Nickelodeon, they opted to move on to other things, including Hey Arnold. But during that time, the pair realized that they didn't have to just work on other people's shows, but could create their very own show. They came up with this concept for a show following a diverse group of kids hanging out in the schoolyard and dealing with the shenanigans of the kids and teachers during their school life, but mostly during recess, because Joe and Paul believed this would give them more time to explore how the kids saw the world. This idea was eventually pitched to Disney, who thought it was solid enough to produce and opted to put it on their child company ABC's One Saturday Morning block. Does anyone remember that? I specifically remember watching Doug on One Saturday Morning. The show was a massive success. Eventually, it was broadcast on all of Disney's various channels and ran from 1997 to 2001 for 6 seasons, and it also had a few special episodes and a full theatrical release. The show was praised critically for the way that characters were presented as shallow stereotypes that kids use or call people.
You know, there is one person who may be able to find you a replacement. Who's that? The hustler kid.
Before then showing that there was much more to every character beyond what they were just pigeonholed as. The writing too was praised for a children's show, as it was formulaic but managed to find a new spin or interesting angle to explore. Now a classic of many people's childhoods, Recess is looked back on with fond memories, and there have even been rumors of a reboot. Because of course there's been rumors, it's Disney. The premise of Recess is pretty straightforward, but the genius is mired in a bit of nuance, so for the sake of clarity I'm going to go through the basic structure of an episode, so in case you want to go back and watch it, like any of it, because all the episodes are basically the same, this is your spoiler warning. Cheeky troublemaker TJ Detweiler leads his friends, the intelligent Gretchen Grundler, the athletic Vince LaSalle, tomboy Ashley Spinelli, heartfelt Mikey Blumberg, and the shy new kid Gus Griswold as they enjoy their regularly scheduled break from class in the great outdoors. It's kind of obvious, but it's worth noting that in-class time is used mostly as a framing device, so the majority of the narrative takes place during school hours, but specifically set during recess, with only the odd break to class time or home life if the narrative of that episode calls for it. The group spends their days playing kickball or any of the other various playground sports, or talking about baseball cards, or sometimes just hanging out.
What do you want, Menlo?
We're kind of busy hanging out.
And a fine job you're doing.
Before too long, a conflict comes about. More often than not, this conflict comes from the school authority figures, and is a change in rules or responsibilities on the playground that have wide-reaching effects or ramifications to the kids on the playground. This can range from changes to the institution or school to changes in the way equipment is handled or handed out. On occasion, these problems stem from the interactions between the children themselves, either individually or as groups, but the resulting widespread effects on the playground are still felt. The gang then bands together to make sure that the changes made are either beneficial to the students or sometimes to the school at large, or fight against those changes they deem unjust. They usually do this by coming together by themselves, or sometimes with other individuals or groups, and on rare occasions, even with the teachers, to solve interpersonal conflicts, and more often than not, to push back against what they see as unfair.
This whomps.
These are the bulk of the episodes, but there are some episodes that are focused on individual characters learning about themselves or about others and how they want to be seen by their world or by their peers. Keep that in mind, because these episodes are also important. First and foremost, I think it's important to talk about the overt artistic themes and references that Recess presents, mostly because I didn't catch them as a child and you may not remember if it's been a hot second. Of course, we have the normal children's television fare. Stories are about morality and having good judgments, as well as explorations of personal identity. It's good stuff, and Recess did this rather well, but it's not these themes that I'm concerned with. It is the overt references to Prison Break and Cold War media that I want to look at. The former, I think, is easier to pick up on from the very start. The show's theme song is a clear reference to Prison Break media. The song itself, while whimsical in nature, is punctuated by a single snare drum in a classic march pattern, with horns punctuating the beginning of a phrase, and then a melody comes in on a tin whistle. As the tension rises, the horns move up in harmony, and towards the end of the song, the horns and tin whistle take over in a full melody before rising to a climax with a short rhythmic cadence, and then the doors slam. A snare played in this way, with the addition of horns and a tin whistle, are indicative of militaristic musical aesthetics in the West. This is precisely the kind of thing you would hear in a prison escape movie around the Cold War era. Top that off with what's happening on screen. The gang are trying to get their hands on a ball to play with, possibly the best or newest one, and TJ has come up with a plan. They then set about putting this plan into motion by distracting other kids and making circumstances look accidental. In the end, the plan works, but they get caught by Miss Finster, but it's all in good fun because you know that during detention, they're gonna cook up another plan to either break out or for whatever other endeavor suits their tastes at the time. So it's lighthearted. Even when they're caught, things will reset in time for the next episode to start, and the focus is on comedy and morality. I also mentioned that Recess tends to play with the strange themes around the Cold War. It's not in every episode, mind you, but as an adult I found that there was this comedic bent to the show where characters would just reference something right out of a Cold War novel, and it's not subtle either, they just straight up say it.
Fifth graders get their own lockers. I can finally keep my inventions safe from foreign spies.
As a kid, I always thought this was just Gretchen trying to avoid people stealing her ideas, but it did strike me as a funny way to talk about cheating. Like, nobody talks like that. But now I think this was explicit because there are a few other episodes that play with this as well. In one episode, the gang suspects their teacher, Ms. Grotke, of being a communist spy, which does seem like a wild leap to jump to now that I think of it. In another episode, the gang finds out that their new friend Jason Stone is actually a spy for the administration to stop the gang from pulling a prank on the superintendent. Plus the fact that there's a lot of emphasis placed on how adults talk or are used to represent ideas of authoritarianism or surveillance. Gus's father, for instance, is an army man, and despite the show taking place ostensibly in the 90s, he does make a lot of references to communism. And Ms. Grotke is a clear representation of hippie culture from the 60s.
It's downright trippy!
So the aesthetics and reference to Cold War and prison escape media are put in place, but they're more than just simple references for fun, because they bolster the themes of the show. As I stated when I did the summary, a significant part of most episodes revolves around something that the administration does to ruin the kids' free time. Principal Prickly here acts as a kind of warden with Miss Finster as the guard. She even has an informant in the form of Randall who rats on the kids in the hopes of benefiting from being in the administration's good books. These roles are very much like that of a prison with the kids as the prisoners. We can even see barbed wire on the top of their schoolyard fence, and I don't know about you, but I did not have that in my schoolyard. We can also see that the rules that are put in place are often ones that restrict the way the kids are allowed to play or enjoy their time at school. In response to this, TJ and the gang come up with lots of ways to fight back against this. In this, we can see that the brutalist and cost-cutting line of thinking by the administration is very reminiscent of how Western propaganda painted life in communist countries, true or not. While TJ, on the other hand, is the charismatic leader of his group of underdogs fighting for freedom, the way that the United States loves to portray Americans. The underdogs standing up for the freedom of the little guy with only their wits and skills. And because it's on a playground, this is all very tongue-in-cheek. The school as a stand-in for a prison and the Cold War ideals make a neat allegory for some interesting storytelling, but in the real world, schools are not really like prisons at all. Actually, according to philosopher Michel Foucault, schools are exactly the same as prisons. In his groundbreaking book, Discipline and Punish, Foucault outlines the history of the prison and eventually lands on modern incarceration systems and how they're seen as a means of rehabilitation. They are essentially institutions of discipline and resocialization based on the perceptions of what is desirable in a person's behavior by society as a whole. In later works, he applied this same principle to schools. They function basically the same way, except instead of rehabilitation into society in order to remedy undesirable behaviors, they are meant to socialize accurately the first time based on the perceptions of what society views as desirable. Apart from a few nuances, school as an educational institute is set up with very similar tasks, and in Foucault's estimation, uses much of the same tools to go about these tasks. Think about it. The way that the administration in Recess presents their ideas is usually by what they feel is best for the children's education. Miss Finster in particular is always going off on how unruly and wild the children are, as though they ought to behave in some way that is more compliant and orderly. Once set in place, these new rules limit the liberties of the children on the playground, or are new ways of punishing the children on the playground. The restriction of liberties is the same as in any prison, and the focus on punishment is a way to hopefully deter undesirable behavior. The outcome of these events or changes is often humorous, as any animated children's show can and should do to illustrate the point, but the fact remains that the school system and the prison system are only different in the amount of liberties that the subjects are permitted to have, but the means of teaching desirable behaviors and punishing undesirable ones are exceedingly similar, and Recess does an excellent job of outlining this. But just because these systems are similar doesn't mean that schools are terrible places, at least most of the time. And Recess is pretty clear about this too, thanks to its main characters. The idea of a school as a prison system is an interesting one, but as I previously stated, not all of the episodes are about the students against the administration. Sometimes the gang finds themselves in conflict with other students. Even though the gang is often responsible for leading the fight against the teachers or administration, it is just as common to see them contend with their fellow peers when not unified in a common goal. This is because the schoolyard itself acts very similarly to a prison yard, in that it is a microcosm of the real world. There might be an overarching authority figure that enforces a strict separation of class of children and administration, but the students themselves also make up their own class structures, just the way they would in a prison system. This time it's just on the playground and has very little to do with the outside influence of their authority figure. And we can see this in the way that the kindergartners seem to have their own civilization.
Why they've taken me? What they're going to do with me? Who knows?
And the fact that the playground has a self-proclaimed king with King Bob. I don't know how he got this title, but the other kids do seem to respect his words and wisdom. These class divides often cause conflicts between groups, and those are interesting episodes. But there are also episodes that focus on the personal growth of one individual character, and these seem to have nothing to do with the themes that I've been pointing out, but I do actually think they're related. British philosopher Bertrand Russel also wrote extensively about the education system. Wait, 2 philosophers in one video? While Foucault was more concerned with the way that prisons and schools use power and discipline to inform behavior, Russell was concerned about the nature of education in schools and their primary target, i.e. the children themselves. He seemed to find that most schools were in the midst of an internal struggle with their own goals. Is the goal of a school to create an ideal citizen, or is it to create an ideal individual? On the surface, it would seem that if an individual is the best they can be, or ideal, then this would lead to a great society, but that's not necessarily the case. An individual's needs are not the same as the group's, so while a citizen is concerned with the good of all and works to maintain society and benefit its fellow citizens, an individual is concerned with their own creative and personal needs, and these may in fact not be in line with maintaining the status quo at all. And this is where Recess really hits on something clever. The show is constantly showing showing how its characters learn to navigate this dichotomy. They often show that they can become citizens and benefit one another, but just as often they break the mold of their class or stereotype in order to fulfill their personal needs. We also see the school and administration itself struggle with this, as Prickly and Finster try to mold good students through the aforementioned rules and discipline, while Ms. Grotke is constantly pushing individualist behaviors. And here we come to the point where Foucault and Russel would both agree on, and that is how the school is used as a means of pushing ideology onto students. The idealized citizen is only made so by the powers that be, who want that citizen to act a certain way and to understand only the knowledge that the powers that be deem important. So becoming a good citizen would mean not questioning the so-called facts or authority that fact givers give. Conversely, teachers don't want their students to be like this at all. They want the individual to think for themselves and fight back, just like TJ and his gang. But this isn't quite so cut and dry either, because sometimes when the gang fights back, it appears that they're being individualistic, but they're actually just fighting back against what they see as unjust regarding their liberties, and the gang winds up engaging in civil disobedience. When the gang is involved in these kinds of movements, they're no longer citizens in terms of the society at large, but are working towards the rights of citizens in their own class, the other children, and they lead these children to fight to reestablish their freedom. This is again contrasted in Recess with other episodes that are dealing with how individuals want to be creatively fulfilled or find their identity. Those episodes are just as important, even though they don't necessarily deal with the school structure or prison structure we've been talking about. They're much more about finding identity, which is just as important, and they're often encouraged by the adults and teachers around them, sometimes in spite of the school. So while Russell struggles with how a school ought to come to terms with the problems of educating a citizen versus educating an individual, Recess shows us that everyone struggles with this, and that sometimes it's about balancing the two depending on what the situation calls for. It's not a cut and dry answer, and every person and possibly every school and teacher need to figure out what this balance looks like for themselves, and how to teach that to others. Recess is a great show, a classic amongst the Saturday morning and after school lineups. It still airs as reruns, and many look back on it with fondness. It certainly was a show that was famous for its hijinks, and that's because it was built on the aesthetic of a genre that was all about hijinks. Using the school as a stand-in for a prison and schoolyard kids as a group of jailbreaking ne'er-do-wells was super clever in order to tell stories about liberty and conformity. But beyond these references, there were some much deeper questions about the nature of civil liberty, how much schools are actually like prisons, and what it means to be both a citizen and an individual, and ultimately what it means to grow up and fight for what is right for you and what is right for all. And Recess told stories that navigated this effectively and clearly. Sometimes the kids were against each other, and other times they allied to fight the administration, and sometimes they even teamed up with Finster, Prickly, and the teachers to fight off even higher powers trying to cause havoc on the playground. Because sometimes individual needs take precedent, and we need to respect that. And other times, the need to be a citizen for your class or possibly for your society and social order needs to be defended. And learning this distinction isn't easy. It might be one of the hardest things that anyone contends with. But what kind of kids show would this be if it didn't try and teach hard lessons about growing up? And that is why Recess might be the greatest depiction of how schools and educational institutions function and how they educate. Here are my stray thoughts. I have the strange sense that there's an episode where the gang try to make it to the back of the schoolyard before the bell rings, but I can't find this episode, so maybe I just dreamt it up, or maybe it was just the water sprinkler episode. It was crazy to go back and rewatch episodes and realize how many details I remembered. Like, not just story beats, but exact words and even how scenes are shot. I love how this show isn't just about kids versus adults, but is more nuanced in the way that conflicts around rights and liberties work, and that the conflicts are often solved more realistically, even if things have to be completely reset for the next episode. Hey, thanks so much for watching that episode. If you enjoyed this topic on learning and growing up, I have a whole playlist on childhood, and you should definitely check that one out. It's got some great stuff like Wednesday and Bluey, and explores lots of different topics. So check that out. Have a look around, because I got lots of different things going on and way more things coming down the pipe right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.